Tom, great to see you.
You too, James.
I thought it'd be fun for us just to compare notes.
Great.
So you wrote The World is Flat. When was that?
2005 it came out, yeah.
And I know we wrote our book, No Ordinary Disruption, back in 2012 or so. But how has the world changed? I mean, you said at the time that the world was flat.
So, the way I think of it, James, is technology moves up in steps. We went from mainframe to PC, and whatnot. That was a big step. And what happens is each step of the new technology proliferates, creates new capabilities, and produces the next step. So I think of 2000, around the year 2000 was a big step, and each step is biased toward a certain set of capabilities. Right. It includes all of them, but they tend to be biased toward one particular new capability. And I think the step around 2000 was biased toward connectivity.
So connecting everybody in the world.
Exactly. And that's because it came out of the dot-com boom, bubble, and bust that had collapsed the price of fiber optic cable. So suddenly, sorry, Mom, didn't know it, but I accidentally wired the world. That suddenly all this cheap fiber optics and then satellites and also wireless came together, and it created a platform where more people than ever could compete, connect, and collaborate for less money in more ways from more places than ever before. And I came along and gave it a name. I said, it feels like the world is flat. And the reason I said that was because people were able to touch people they could never touch before. I call my mom in Minneapolis, and she tells me I'm interrupting her because she's playing bridge on the internet with someone in Siberia. Okay, and also people could touch you in ways they never could before.
Well, and also at that time, and the touch was actually pretty far, right?
Yes.
I could touch family and friends in London, in Harare. I mean, so it was the reach of that was just.
And that was the whole point. That was that connectivity became fast, virtually free, easy for you, and ubiquitous. That set of technologies scaled, and I would argue they then produced the next step up, which was around 2007, which of course was kicked off with the emergence of the iPhone. Now, those suite of technologies were the iPhone, cloud, big data, and the beginnings of AI. And what that step was about, I would argue, was complexity. That's what happened in 2007 was that complexity became fast, virtually free, easy for you, and invisible. So what all those technologies did together was allowed us to just abstract away so much complexity in so many things we never imagined.
So what's an example of that?
Well, I could go on my iPhone, and now with one touch, I could page a taxi, direct the taxi, pay the taxi, rate the taxi, and be rated by the taxi with one touch. Right. We abstracted away all that complexity. My friend Craig Money from Microsoft likes to say we put grease into everything. Suddenly, with just the lightest touch, you could move so many things through, again, robotics, AI, big data, and all coming together to abstract away complexity in so many ways.
But that was also true for not just individuals. You gave the taxi example, the ride example, but businesses were doing the same thing too,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah, in their supply chains, in how they orchestrated and worked with suppliers and vendors and customers, they were doing the same thing.
Exactly, but it tended to be bigger businesses, I would argue, and particularly big manufacturers who had a lot of return on investment and could afford to substitute labor for machines.
Right.
Now, the third step, which is, I think, what we're in the middle of right now, is that basically the world has gone from flat to fast to deep. It's all what you can do now with no touch. Okay, it's Siri. Give me all of James's our latest articles. No touch at all. Right. What happened basically between 2007, I would argue, and today, James, and this really hit me in recent weeks. I've been traveling a lot of places, and people are all been nice to you, and they say, "Hey, you're working on a new book." Right. And I'd say, well, I just wrote a book, about 2007, which is about the three largest forces in the world: the market, globalization, climate, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law technology, all accelerating. So I don't have three new forces to tell you about. And in thinking about that, I realized that actually what's happened since 2007 is not that three new forces have manifested itself. It's that these three have gone deep now. Now they've gone really deep. So as you noted, James, in 2007, and when you wrote your book, on No Ordinary Disruption, it was about big companies. Now, it's about individuals. I was playing golf in Florida last week, and my caddy said to me, I went down to an electronics store. I got a little camera for my front door, and one for the and for my lobby, and I can now on my iPhone see when the package guy delivers something.
Right.
Now that was something companies can do when you wrote your book in 2012. Now it's something my caddy can do. Okay, so all of these things have gone deep, and they're triggered now by no touch.
Right. But I would argue, though, Tom, that even that second stage, when we abstracted away the complexity, that wave is still going.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because one of the things that we found that's quite striking is that if whether you call the complexity or you call it digitization,
Yes.
There are some parts of the economy, some companies, some sectors, some countries that have gone pretty far.
Right.
But there are many others, companies, sectors, and countries that are still, you have yet to do that.
Yes.
So we're starting to get these differential rates of even the three waves you just described. So
it's why I like to use the term deep, because in fact, again, each one is always part of each one.
Right.
But what's happening now is they're all going fast. So the connectivity has gotten even more intense.
Right.
The ability to abstract complexity away has gotten even more rich. And then we're taking them both deeper into the economy so more people, companies, and places can participate in it. And so what I'm not thinking about is, because this keeps moving up in steps,
Right.
What's the next step, baby? So from flat to fast to deep, I think the next step is psychic. I now know your whole psychograph from your phone. I will just push you your groceries, push you the supplies you need, push you the information you need. And I think I could already see, the one after that. And it would be called genomic. That I now have a watch, or I have smart clothes on you, that I can actually read your human genome. So I can tell you what health what drugs you need to buy,
Right.
what supplies you need to buy, that my neurons will connect with your genome. Basically.
So are you saying then, Tom, that the next waves, that sounds to me, the psychic sounds to me like AI?
Exactly. And Siri and
Siri and all the rest of it, all
Yes.
these different technologies. And the genomic sounds like just the kind of the synthetic biology, biological revolution that we're going through.
That
So
gets then built into our clothes, our watch, and then linked up with Walmart. Right. So you go, Walmart tells you, we know, given your genome, these are the foods you should buy. And these are the health aids you need. And I think that's roughly where we're going, from flat to fast to deep to psychic to genomic.
But let's stay with the psychic or the AI portion of that. One of the things that's quite striking, so we've been doing quite a lot of research just on the impact of AI. And what's striking about that is that on the one hand, I think, clearly, businesses, individuals will benefit from the psychic when these technologies can deliver us and help us do things that we wouldn't do ourselves. We wouldn't even know how to do ourselves. It also seems as if the economy itself would benefit because in the sense that, as companies become more productive, as the economy becomes more productive, that actually helps the economy in terms of driving economic growth. Right. I think the big question for many people comes down to how do we think about the ethics of these technologies and the mis and misuse concerns about those kind of psychic or AI-based technologies, and of course the issue of work. But I'm sure we'll come back to the question of work. But how do you think about?
So let's start with the ethics question, which I think is hugely important. Right. So I actually just wrote a column the other day about how the College Board had sat down, the leaders of the College Board, the people who administer the SAT exams, that now really has a big impact on what people study in high school. Yeah. And they sat down and did a sort of a radical thought experiment with themselves that, of course, it's good that kids know everything, science and math and humanities and art, of course. But if they had to choose two things that they thought every kid had to have the tools for, what would they be? And they came up with two codes. You need to master two codes. One, the ability to code a computer, or at least understand how a computer works. And the second is the U.S. Constitution.
That's interesting.
And when you think about it, James, the two actually go together. It goes back to your privacy question. So the deeper we go into computing, and the deeper computing goes into us, and the ethical and privacy questions that will raise, the more you want people imbued with knowledge of the Constitution and the 5 freedoms, and it isn't just freedom of speech. It's a freedom of assembly and petition and all these other things.
So how do we combine those two things? Clearly, there's a need to understand how the systems of these machines work, and then also these call them civics or societal-based principles. How do we bring those two things to work? The reason I bring that up is partly because even on the computer science part of it, one of the challenges with these concerns about fairness and bias and so forth about the use of these technologies comes down to the fact that technically it's actually quite hard to code for fairness.
Right.
Technically, it's actually quite hard to get at things like explainability. So why did the algorithm decide to do that versus that? Why that prediction versus this? What in the data set or the feature set led to that? Those are actually very hard computer science questions. And, there's work going on at that. But so we've got that challenge. Then we've got the challenge you're posing, which is how do we combine that with civics and philosophy and ethics? What would you say? I mean, how would you do that?
Well, you're really talking about two boxes in a way. One is a work box, and one is an ethics values box. So let's try to disaggregate them for a second. I think the work challenge I described this way. What was basically happened as a result of the no ordinary disruptions we've been through is that the foundation of the American middle class has completely shrunk almost to zero. What was the foundation of the American middle class? By the way, the European middle class and the Asian middle class. It was something called a high-wage, middle-skilled job.
Yes.
High wages, but middle-skilled. So my uncle in the early 1960s was the loan officer at the Farmers and Mechanics Bank in Minneapolis, and he only had a high school degree. Now, is there any loan officer at any bank anywhere, that only has a high school degree today? No. So he had a high-wage, he had middle skills, but he actually had a high-wage job. Well, that actually was the foundation of the middle class. And everything we need to be thinking about today, I believe, if you're running for president, is how you return the high wage. It doesn't have to be middle skilled. It's going to actually be higher skilled just by the nature of things. But because basically what happens when the high wage middle skilled job disappeared, we now have high wage high skilled jobs. We have low wage low skilled jobs. As your research has shown, those are growing actually. Right. But how do we get more people into the high wage high skill band of jobs? That I think is the central economic and political question for society if you want to have a stable middle class.
No, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, in some ways, we're already there. That problem already exists, right? Because think about the conversations the last 5 or so years about income inequality. Some of the work we've done highlights, of course, income inequality is there, and it's actually gotten worse. But the really striking thing is the wage stagnation that we've seen.
For decades.
For decades. And in fact, in some ways, arguably, it could be at the root of some of the angst and concerns that society has. And then you layer on top of that the trends we're talking about, the impact of technology and so forth. And you can just, if you project it forward, so one of the things that we don't worry about, at least not as much on this technology jobs question, is this issue about will there be enough jobs? Right. I think, all the scenarios and all the work we've done and other economists have begun to do suggest there will be enough jobs, at least in the next couple of decades. Now, of course, you should always worry about that because things could change and so forth. But what will absolutely be real challenges are probably a few key things. One is this question about how occupations are going to shift, because we know that as technology starts to automate some work and some activities, some occupations are going to decline. But others are going to rise. And to your example about just what's happened to the middle class, many of the occupations that are going to decline have had middle wage incomes at middle wage skills, and those are going to decline. Yeah. The ones that are growing, that will grow, don't look like there will be high income earning jobs. So as that plays out between the jobs lost and the jobs gained, even though there'll be enough work, then you worry about 3 big transitions, and I'm going to test these on you to see what you think, whether we're ready to deal with this. One is how we deal with the occupational shifts. People moving from one occupation to another, often one place to another. That's a big challenge. The scale of that is quite substantial. The second question are what you might call skill shifts. In some cases, the skills needed are going to be much higher. In some cases, they're just different. So how do people navigate the skill shift, which is quite substantial? Mm-hmm. And then the third one is one you're alluding to, which is the income wage question, which is, will people be able to earn enough? And those are pretty big challenges, even in a world where there's enough work.
So back in the 50s, I was born in 1953, when people were running for office back in Minnesota, there were a lot of one-word answers: raise taxes, lower taxes, more Social Security, more Medicare, whatever.
Grow the economy.
Exactly.
It all worked out.
I think that what is different about this moment, James, is if you're running for office and you're an honest politician, actually there are 100 different answers. It's not going to be just one simple fix, okay? And what's also scary is they change every year. All right, and so the old days we can just sort of rely on, I'm a Democrat, that's what this means, you know.
Right.
So let's go down the list. Well, what you described, the world you described, there's one thing we know for sure, that your health care, your pension, and your learning, which has to be the newest entitlement program, basically, the ability to be a lifelong learner, all three of those have to become ubiquitous and mobile. So that if I'm running for office, I start there. You know, I mean, that's how do I make your pension, your health care affordable, and your learning mobile and easily accessible for your life. I think those are the three central questions for lifting people back into the middle class. So that's a broad economic answer. That's at the national level.
Right.
At the local level, I think there's a community answer. And that's how communities come together and build what I call complex adaptive coalitions, where business, labor, philanthropists, educators, social entrepreneurs, and local government all network together to build a coalition to entice the companies, to inspire startups, to create those jobs. Today, you need 3 people starting jobs for 7. You need 8 people starting jobs for 30. You need 2 starting jobs, for 20. That's where we're going to get those 25,000 jobs. So if I were running for office, I'd be running as a startup Democrat. We basically we're seeing the cleavage in the Democratic Party. The world has changed, and more is on you. And that means 2 things. One is you have to be a lifelong learner. If you want to be a lifelong employee at the New York Times or McKinsey, you've got to be a lifelong learner. My friend Heather McGowan always likes to say, Mom, Dad, never ask your kids what you want to be when you grow up, because whatever it is won't be here, unless it's policeman or fireman. Only ask your kids how you want to be when you grow up. Will you have an agile learning mindset? Will you be predisposed to be a lifelong learner? But that then leads to another big challenge. Right. James, if we were here 10 years ago, one of the first questions you'd ask me is, Tom, what do you think about the digital divide? And we say, boy, big digital divide. Hey, parts of Washington, D.C. aren't connected, and parts of Washington are, okay? America's got internet, Central Africa doesn't, okay? They're really disadvantaged as a result of that. In 5 years, James, ain't going to be no digital divide. All right. I think in 5 years, everyone who wants a network connection, virtually everyone is going to be able to have one. And when that happens, my friend Marina Gorbis from the Institute of the Future taught me this. Then the biggest divide in the world is going to be the self-motivation divide. Who has the self-motivation to be that lifelong learner long after they've left home and your mom and dad aren't there to say, Tommy, have you done your homework? And unfortunately, not everyone is built that way. See, a lot of people were built, and by the way, these are wonderful people. They built our country. We told them what to do, and they did it. Right. Okay, right. We owe them a huge debt. Unfortunately, just doing what you're told now will not get you into that high-wage, high-skill bracket.
So you're emphasizing the key defining or differentiating thing for individuals being motivation,
yes,
and inclination to do things. And I get that. I guess I'm trying to imagine how this feels.
And by the way, for anyone's not up for that, I want to take care of them.
Yes.
Right. That's why I want my taxes raised, to take care of those people, because the world may just be too damn fast for a lot of people, for some people,
Well, and it already is. I mean, one of the things that I find quite striking is that if you look at, for example, your typical average American household, yes, and you think about, so what effectively, if you look at the median, what are the things that dominate their expenditures? It tends to be housing, education, and healthcare.
All going up.
All going up.
Don't tell them there's no inflation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're going up often at a rate much faster than their incomes are going up.
Yeah.
So I think this question about how do we help and assist or create the environment or the circumstances so that those families can manage through this, I think is quite important. And also, going back to your point about community, one of the things that's quite striking is, it's often easy to talk about these things at a national level. Right. But if you go, to your point, community by community, you find a pretty interesting kind of mosaic of communities around the country. So we've looked, for example, county by county, and you look at these different counties. Yes, there are some counties and places where the economy is relatively vibrant, It's a diverse economy. Educational attainment, the profile of what's going on in people, the households, and so forth is, they're set up to do well. There are others, you might call them distressed Americana, where it doesn't look like that. And so the questions for each of these communities can be quite different. In some cases, the questions are more about how do you enable economic development. In some cases, you want to prioritize how do you improve education. So to your point, it isn't just a one slogan answer for every place. The list looks, as you said, like 100, and the places look like 100 places too.
Exactly.
So how do we do that when the complexity, the mosaic is very local, place to place, person to person, household to household, county to county? How do we do that?
Well, the beginning wisdom is to understand the problem. What is the title of your of that study? 'Cause I think everyone should go read it. I think it's hugely important.
Yeah, so Walmart drew on some of our research. It's called the America at Work.
America at Work. People should look that up.
They should look at that
because
and
it's
look at
really
the research
good.
underlying that.
Right.
And it paints this mosaic of different places around the country.
Basically, what I learned from it is that the cliche about America is we're a country divided between two coasts. So two coasts that are liberalizing, pluralizing, globalizing, diversifying, modernizing, and then there's flyover America, where everyone's supposedly high on opioids, voting for Trump, and waiting for 1950 to come back. Actually, that is completely wrong. You only have to be from flyover America, Minnesota, like I am, to know just how wrong that is, because Minneapolis actually is a quite thriving place. Not in every neighborhood, but in the aggregate it is. And so actually the country is divided, in my view, James, between towns and cities, counties, that are able to create complex adaptive coalitions where business, labor, educators, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, local government all come together to improve their resilience and propulsion, and those that can't, and they're collapsing from the bottom down. So one is from the ground down collapsing, the other is from the ground up rising, and they can be right next door to each other.
Right.
I profile Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's thriving next to York, Reading, Harrisburg, not doing so well. And what also makes this doubly hard is that what differentiates the ones that build these coalitions and don't is a category of leadership that I call leaders without authority. Okay, this is an idea I got from one of my teachers, Giddy Greenstein, who's done this study in Israel.
Right.
Leaders without authority. This is a very interesting category.
Are these activists? Are they community
They're
leaders?
community leaders who simply step up and say, not going to happen in my town on my watch. And then they pull together a coalition, a complex adaptive coalition, and that's what all these towns have in common.
Right.
A cross-sector coalition that does, and rule number one is, you check your politics at the door, baby. Do not come in this room. We're just going to do best practices, best ideas. Don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. Right. And so it's a very different kind of politics. So let me ask you a question. We'll do a thought experiment, James. I'm a member of the steel union in Pittsburgh today, okay? Monday to Friday, oh man, I'm with labor. Solidarity, baby, solidarity.
Right.
But on Saturday, I drive for Uber. And on Sunday, I rent out my kid's spare bedroom on Airbnb. And in the afternoon, I go to Walmart to get the cheapest Chinese-made goods I can. And what I can't find there, I buy from a bot on Amazon.com.
Right.
Monday to Friday, I'm with labor, baby. Saturday and Sunday, I'm with capital. So how do you give a party that spans those two interests? Yeah.
Well, those interests actually vary even more. Let me
please,
add to the thought experiment. Right. One of the things that's quite striking is that if you look at individuals, I would argue individuals are several things in a political economy. Mm-hmm. They're consumers.
Yes.
They're workers. Mm-hmm. They are savers or investors. Mm-hmm. They're citizens. Mm-hmm. And then they're human beings who live in a planet that's prone to environmental and other change.
Good way to put it. I like
if you take all those parts of us,
right.
There was a time 50 years ago.
They all lined up.
They all lined up.
Yeah.
So what was good for one is good for the other, right? They're all largely lined up. Today, it's unclear, right? Take globalization. Was wonderful for consumers, for people as consumers. Right. They could shop anywhere. They could get cheap products. Product cost of consumption went down dramatically. Great story. What about people as workers? Not so clear. Yeah. Not so clear. People as investors, right? So
fantastic. I can invest in the Zimbabwe stock market.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can invest anywhere.
Yeah.
I can invest in anything. Look at the returns.
Yeah.
So unless so on the one hand,
I like that a lot.
I may hate things as a worker,
right?
But as an investor, I may like what's happening in the economy, in the stock market.
Yeah.
Then there's the person as a citizen. A worker is tied up in these global value chains. They're not national, but a citizen is. For the most part, when it comes to people voting or participating, they tend to participate as workers. Mm-hmm. You can more closely correlate their choices.
Interesting.
As workers as opposed to as consumers.
Right.
As opposed to, so I think one of the challenges we now have is the things, as you said, that used to line up, whether it's political parties or the interests of the individual, they've all been taken apart.
Exactly. And that's why I tend to use the theme of nature as a much better framework for thinking about this moment we're going through than political science.
Okay, to say more about that.
So I think we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once.
Okay.
We're in the middle of the change of the climate.
Right.
We're going from later to now.
Right.
So when I was growing up in Minnesota in the 50s, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I can do it now, I can do it later.
Right.
Today, later is officially over. Later will now be too late. So whatever you can save, please save it now. That's a climate change.
Right.
Second, we're going through a change in the climate of globalization. We're going from an interconnected world, and you guys have done the best work on this, to an interdependent world. Oh, an interdependent world. You get a geoeconomic inversion. First of all, your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. You have Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night. We probably had to cancel this meeting because you'd have been pulled out by McKinsey to do something. Well, Greece, Italy, they're in NATO. They're in the EU. They're allies. They can kill us in an interdependent world. And in an interdependent world, something else happens. Your rival falling becomes more dangerous than your rival rising.
Right.
So we're going through a climate change in globalization, and we're going climate change in climate, and lastly, we're going through a climate change in business. So, because all these new technologies, what have they done? They've actually created a world. Now, I'm a big believer, oh, this in the world is flat. Whatever can be done will be done. The only question is, will it be done by you or to you? Just don't think it won't be done. It'll either be done by you, by a competitor, or a bad guy, because both are early adopters, all right? So that's why I spend a lot of my time with companies. People say, hey, you're the foreign affairs columnist. Why are you hanging around at Walmart? Because when I know what the company competing with Amazon.com can do, I know where the tip of the spear is. Well, that'll tell me actually what bad guys can do. It'll tell me a lot more. I can reverse engineer that into a lot of geopolitics. Okay. So what can be done today? Every company today in the world of AI and big data, first of all, it can sensorize. It can capture all the data around its business. Okay, now a company can actually know what it knows. Okay, number one. Then it can take that data and analyze it with big data now and AI and find the needle in the haystack of its data as the norm, not the exception. See patterns it could never see before. Right. I can prophesize now using this. I can do all kind of predictive analytics. I can customize just for guys from Minnesota with brown eyes and a mustache. Right. I can localize just for Southeast Washington, D.C., where we are right now. I can socialize. I can leverage social networks to connect with my customers, my suppliers, and my employees in ways I never could before. And as you guys have written so well, I can digitize and automatize every job and product and service faster than fast. You put all those together, every business in the world is going through a climate change. And as you guys have taught me, maybe 20% are through that process. So 80% have to go. Holy mackerel. That is a climate change.
Well, and also just being in terms of being through the process, you see it again at the company level, sector level, economy level. Yeah. So we did an interesting exercise just to measure how digitized is the U.S. economy. You can build it up sector by sector by sector. And what the conclusion you come to is that we're only about 18-19% all the way through. There's still a vast part of the economy in the U.S. that's still to be fully digitized, and so that's still coming. So I guess all of these, but I guess what I sense, and you're saying this too, Tom, if you look at whatever lens you use, whether it's the company, the sector, the economy, even the individual lens, there are going to be wide ranges of outcomes.
Wider than ever.
Wider than ever for individuals, for companies, for sectors, maybe even for economies. Is that a good thing in your view? And how do we adapt? And you mentioned that the way to think about
within climate change. So
systems.
Good or bad are not in my vocabulary because they're here and nothing I can do about it. So I'm trying to think about how to manage it, like climate change. To manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. For all of these things. Right. Well, as I thought about that, James, I said, who do I go to? What do you want when you're in the middle of climate change? You want two things: resilience. You're able to take a blow because stuff happens, and you want propulsion. want to be able to move ahead in the world. You want to be hiding under the chairs with me saying, James, come out, the climate change
Right.
is over, okay?
Gotta be on the
So
move.
how do I get resilience and propulsion? Well, I sat back and thought about that, and I said, who can I interview on resilience and propulsion besides McKinsey Global Institute? And then I realized I knew this woman. She was 3.8 billion years old. Her name was Mother Nature. And she dealt with more climate changes than anybody. So I called her up, made an appointment, went out to see her.
Right.
Okay, I said, Mother Nature, how do you produce resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? She said, well, I'll tell you everything I do, I actually do unconsciously, but these are my strategies. Okay,
Right.
First of all, she said, I'm incredibly adaptive. In my world, it's not the strongest that survive, not the smartest that survive. It's the most adaptive that survive. And I teach that lesson through a process I call natural selection. You may have heard of it. Okay. Secondly, she said, I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Wherever I see a blank spot in nature, I fill it with a plant or animal perfectly adapted to that niche. Third, she said, I'm incredibly pluralistic. Oh, James, I'm the most pluralistic person you've ever met. I try 20 different species of everything. I see who wins. I love diversity. And you know, she told me something interesting, James. She told me she noticed her most diverse ecosystems are also her most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. I love pluralism. Fourth, she said, I'm incredibly sustainable. Nothing's wasted in my world. Everything is food. Eat food, poop seed. Eat food, poop seeds. Nothing's wasted. Fifth, she said, I noticed that my ecosystems that are the most resilient and propulsive build complex adaptive systems where all the parts network together, the soils, the plants, the animals, the tree, they network together. That really maximizes their resilience and propulsion. Seventh, she said, I'm incredibly hybrid and heterodox. I'll try anything. No dogmatism in my world. I'll try any trees with any soils. I'll try any bees with any flowers. I'm always experimenting. Eighth, she said, I'm a lifelong learner. And I apply my learning through genomics very quickly. But I'm always experimenting, learning, applying, okay? And lastly, James, she did say, I do believe in the laws of bankruptcy, Tom. I kill all my failures. I return them to the great manufacturer in the sky, and I take their energy to nourish my successes. So my argument is that the company, the community, the county, the city, the town, that most closely mirrors Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes is the one that will thrive in this age of acceleration.
Have you seen any examples?
Yeah, at the community level, lots of them. Those are those complex adaptive coalitions. I think they come closest to it. But we're living in an age now, James, where national politics everywhere is, not everywhere, but in many places is paralyzed by partisanship. At the other extreme, the single family, for the reasons you explained, is too weak, okay? So it's actually the healthy community that is the right political unit for the 21st century. So if I were running for president, I'd be running as a progressive localist. How do I push authority down to the highest trust level? Because government moves at the speed of trust, and today, baby, you need to move fast. And I'd be pushing more and more down to that local level.
And actually, by the way, I love that. Looking to Mother Nature for solutions. And I also like the two ends of the spectrum you just painted, right? Because one of the things that I think we've learned from economic history, especially with regards to, when have we had instances of flourishing, but also absence of wars and conflict? It's when entities have become very interdependent. Because otherwise, if you don't have interdependency, you're North Korea. Or if you take it down to the community level, if you don't have interdependence, you're just down to a family, and those are kinship relationships. Right. They often don't have the diversity, they don't have the interdependency. Right. And so the question is, how do you build this kind of economic interdependency? Because we know that when that happens, there's much less conflict and there's prosperity. That's what seems to be not to be happening as much.
I would add another thing to your list, which is a very important list. And I'd add one more thing. In a rapidly changing world, the most open system gets the signals first. So you will learn fastest. If you close yourself off, and you can see which part of the worlds are struggling today with high kinship relationships, low trust, low openness. You know what I mean? It's true of North Korea. It's true of certain countries all over the world. You can just tell why they're struggling. You know what I mean?
Right. So what are the things you worry about, Tom?
James, I recently changed my business card.
You did?
Oh, yeah.
Why?
It used to say
Did
Thomas
you
L.
change jobs?
I know. In a way, yeah. That's a good way to put it. It used to say Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times Foreign Affairs columnist. Right. It now says Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times, Humiliation, Dignity, Leadership, Trust, Community, Culture, and Amplification correspondent. Why does it say that? Well, first of all, I realized that what I've been doing for 40 years as a journalist, but the last 23 as a columnist, I've actually been covering a lot of people acting out on their humiliation and questing for dignity. Some of them are Trump voters who feel humiliated by the world leaving them behind. Some of them is Putin. People like him who feel the collapse of the Soviet Union has humiliated what was a great power and a great civilization. China after a century of humiliation. Palestinians versus Israelis. Muslim youth in Europe against the majority there. That's all I do, is cover people acting out on their humiliation and questing for dignity. So one of the things I'm always about is, how do I help you? You know, you got to do it on your own, but what can I do for you to overcome that feeling of humiliation? Because I think that's central to driving a lot of the instability in the world today. And that actually is why I call myself amplification correspondent, because one of the things I've learned, mostly from my mistakes, okay, things like, you know, supporting the Iraq War, is I'm not smart enough, okay, to figure out how to fix your country. But I bet you are. And now wherever I see something good and decent, I want to amplify it. That'll be self-sustaining. Tunisia, why is it the one Arab country that made a successful transition from Arab Spring to constitutional democracy is the country we had nothing to do with?
So what do you think happened there?
Educated women, much more than anywhere else in the Arab world, thanks to their founding father, Bourguiba. Educated women, strong civil society. He allowed strong trade unions, okay? Moderate Islamist organization, a tiny army. He never invested in army. And so when I see something good now, like if I were running American foreign policy, one of the things I would do is I would say to the Tunisians, exactly how much money can we give you? Because we've basically given them about $1 billion since 2011. We give Afghanistan $45 billion a year. That's how much we spend, I should say, in the war in Afghanistan. Think about that. $1 billion investment over 4 years in the one self-sustaining success model, and $45 billion, that's actually low because years have been higher, trying to change a country that just doesn't want to change itself. That's why culture's in my list, because as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy every morning, okay? And leadership is there, because what I've learned all these years is whether you're leading a 2-person newsroom or 2,000-person newspaper, leadership really matters. My wife, you know, was a school teacher. She had a great principal for 8 years. That principal left. Different principal came in, and the school did not do well. Okay, leadership.
So leadership.
And so that's my long-winded answer to your question. You know, trust is there because my teacher, Dov Seidman, always says trust is the only legal performance-enhancing drug. Oh, baby, when there's trust in the room, good things. We can go so fast, and when there's no trust, ownership also is on there on my new card. And ownership is there because when your son owns his own education, when a teacher owns their own classroom, when people own their own country, good things happen. I'm a big believer in the dictum that in the history of all mankind, no one has ever washed a rented car. And no one's ever washed a rented classroom, and no one's ever washed a rented school, and no one's ever washed a rented country. When people own things, much better chance that good things will happen. Yeah. You know. And lastly, I'm the community correspondent, because community is so important. If the big government's paralyzed, the single family's too weak, healthy community becomes the trampoline and the safety net, I think, for a lot of individuals. And so if you add up everything we've just said now, in the last half hour, you realize if we were to turn out and make a political party out of it, do you realize how diverse our list would be? How many different things we'd be talking about? Different safety nets for the individual, mobile, lifelong learning, community, constant experimentation. Show me which party could line up with those, you know. And people say, "Oh, Friedman, you're a centrist." A centrist. Suddenly, being a centrist is terrible. You know, what I tell people is, I'm not a centrist. Excuse me, I'm not even on your grid. I'm on a different grid. Okay, I'm not just some mush between Republicans and Democrats that I can't figure out. I'm not there because I can't figure out where to go. I'm there because I know where to go. All right, and trying to bridge you two is not where I want to go. I'm on a completely different grid.
Yeah, no, actually, what's interesting about that is I think quite often the notion of centrist has become the middle of the other two.
Right, exactly, yeah.
When in fact what you're describing is a
dynamic centrism.
Dynamic centrism.
If you want to call it that, I don't even know. Right. That's why I opt for Mother Nature's language, because I'm looking at a completely different mentor. You know, I mean, not how do I get this from this party and that from that party. I'm thinking what produces resilience and propulsion, and how can I offer that and sell that to more people, okay? And clearly, I don't have the far right. Clearly, I don't have the far left. And so if that leaves people in the center as the audience, that's great, but I need a critical mass in order to make this change.
Right.
And that's what goes back to your leadership question, because the real point is that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Let me get to another area that I think may be ripe for reform or change. People are starting to think about how do we reform capitalism or the market economy, what companies do. I mean, we've had, for a long time, at least, especially in the United States, a very dominant shareholder capital, shareholder value orientation to things. What would you say about, is there a need in your mind to reform how capitalism works? Or are the reforms mostly about our political leadership, which you described very articulately?
Yeah.
But what needs to happen in terms of how the market economy or capitalism works? Same as before, different?
Yeah, I certainly think that we have an antitrust issue now. That we have companies that I think are simply so big. They don't, in the old way of antitrust, actually threaten me as a consumer, because actually they lower prices. They threaten me as a citizen. That they have so much market power now that their antitrust threat is to me as a citizen and what they can impose.
So it's back to this question of human being as consumers,
right? Exactly.
Worker, different.
And that's naturally going to flip antitrust into a totally new realm.
So how do you think about that? Because now, if I'm a company or anybody in the market economy, do I now have to think about people as consumers, as workers, as citizens? I never had to think about that question before.
Absolutely.
Some might even think that even the way we measure success needs to go much beyond just simply shareholder value creation, right?
Absolutely.
We need to, whether we borrow from, one of the things that the Europeans have always done is have always had more of a stakeholder model, where at the table you've got labor and workers and everybody. But is that to suggest that we, in addition to the transparency, should market capitalists be moving more in that stakeholder
direction? So I find myself much more attracted to that Danish, Scandinavian model. Right. I think it's more relevant than ever. But when I total up, James, everything we've been talking about, I always tell people, it's such a cliche, we're at a Gutenberg moment. But I always tell people, look, someone was alive when Gutenberg invented the printing press, and some monk said to some priest, "No, that's really cool. You mean I don't have to write these Bibles out longhand anymore? I can just stamp them out." I believe we are at such a moment. We just happen to be here when the printing press of the 21st century version, the internet and big data and AI was born, and it is changing everything. And that's the common denominator in our conversation. It's changing business, it's changing citizenship, it's changing communities, changing countries. And therefore, unless you transform your party, your community, to be a complex adaptive coalition that can respond at the speed of this change when national governments can't and the single family's too weak.
Right.
We're all going to be in trouble. So you and I can talk about what's right, but that's really what we need. It's a different approach to thinking about all of these issues.
So to wrap, are you optimistic?
I'm always optimistic. I was born that way. I'm from Minnesota, and how could I not be optimistic? My dad never made more than $18,000 a year. And yet I grew up in this amazing middle-class neighborhood, St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Right. I grew up in the same time, in the same town with the Coen brothers, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, Michael Sandel. Right. Gave us Sharon Isbin, the guitarist, gave us an incredible optimism about possibility. And my dad only made $18,000 a year, And no one seemed richer or poorer than anybody else. And I got the opportunity to be a columnist at the New York Times. So how could I not be an optimist? But how could I be a crazy optimist or cockeyed optimist when I'm going around the world? I'm seeing not only the suffering, but I'm seeing these incredible challenges for a lot of other good people being born in middle-class circumstances today who are really suffering by wage stagnation and suffering just under the pressure of all these accelerations. And so I'm torn. I lean optimistic because that's just how I was born.
Right.
But I'm a cautious optimist. I'm not a cockeyed optimist because I know one thing. This actually is about leadership. It's about making the right decisions. That it's not just going to happen. We've tended to treat American exceptionalism, where we're exceptional, as like it was an honorary degree we got on the wall. It's up there. It always says I'm exceptional. I just look at it. I'm exceptional. You know,
Policy for
yeah.
the time.
No, you got to earn and re-earn that every day.
Right.
And that means you got to be thinking all the time. You know, the listener to this video will have no idea. This conversation we've had is the product of, I don't know, 30 discussions we've had.
Over the
and
years,
we just keep peeling this onion to get down to it. And you go out in the world and I go out and we come back and we share, we take our nuts, we crack them open, we share the things we discover inside, you know. But, so it's exhausting.
So you know, I probably have never told you this. It may be that this conversation has actually been happening over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Let me tell you why. So you grew up in Minnesota.
Yes.
I don't know if I've ever told you this, Tom. My father was in Hutchinson, Minnesota in the early 60s.
Really?
He had got a Fulbright, he was the first black African to get a Fulbright scholarship to go to come to the States.
From what country?
From Zimbabwe.
Wow,
It was Rhodesia at the time.
Yeah.
And he spent a year living in Hutchinson, Minnesota in the early 60s.
Amazing.
So they might have run into each other, who knows?
Wow. You know, many years ago, one of the great things being a New York Times columnist, your papers all over the world use your column. And in Israel, Haaretz, which is kind of the New York Times of Israeli papers, sort of highbrow, they've been running my column in Hebrew. Very important, because then my column gets really into the local blood system. And several years ago, I was having a dinner with the editor of Haaretz. He had several people at the dinner. One was an Israeli general, Uzi Dayan, and the editor said, Tom, you know, I said, why do you run my column? And he said, Tom, it's because you're the only optimist we have. And Uzi Dayan, the general, said, I know why you're an optimist, Tom. I said, why? He says, because you're short. And I said, sure, about that. He said, yeah, you can only see that part of the glass that's half full. Okay, so I'm not actually that short, shorter than you, but I try to look at the part that's half full, because the world's got enough pessimists, James. So having someone who's a little bit of a cockeyed optimist doesn't hurt.
Well, this has been fun.
I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks for making the time.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
We should do this
Thank you.
again.
I really appreciate it.